Okay, this is our last bit for today. Actually, maybe I'll go back a little bit to a previous diagram and remind you that we were talking about how thinner vocal folds can open and close more quickly than thicker vocal folds, which is why we get this effect of thinner vocal folds or more tense vocal folds vibrating at a higher rate, a higher fundamental frequency than lower vocal folds. Yeah, and then another part that you need to keep in mind for this is that the vocal folds, when they do open and close, do not actually open and close all at once. Or maybe another way to put it is when they are thinner, it is easier for them to sort of approximate opening and closing all at once than when they're thicker. When they are thicker, the upper and lower parts of the vocal folds are actually going to open and close out of phase with each other. And so what does it mean when I say that? That's a term I borrowed from the mathematics of sine waves. So you can think about it. Here are your two vocal folds, relatively thick, pushed up against each other, and air is going to come up from your lungs due to the mechanisms we now know about in great detail. And as that air pushes up, it's going to separate the bottoms of the vocal folds apart from each other first before it gets to the top. So that part is going to open first, and then eventually it'll get through the second half, and then the whole thing will pop open. Air will go out and into the pharynx and the rest of your mouth. And then as the Bernoulli effect kicks in, as air is flowing through here, the lower parts of the vocal folds are actually going to come together first. And then after that, the top parts of the vocal folds will come together later, and then eventually the whole thing will be closed and we'll repeat the entire cycle again. But you can think about that in terms of the lower parts of the vocal folds going through this cycle slightly earlier than the top parts of the vocal folds. So these open earlier than the top parts of the vocal folds, and they close earlier than the top parts of the vocal folds. So that's what I mean by out of phase. They're both going through the same cycle, but just slightly offset from each other in time. This is kind of an idealization of how this works, just using a nice sort of black and white diagram. It's not this perfectly nice and clear in reality, but it's fairly close. What I'll tell you first before I show you what this sort of looks like in a representation that we can use is that the glottal opening and closing pattern will form a complex wave. This is another diagram from the Speech Science Primer textbook, which also shows you kind of the bottoms opening up before the tops and then closing in the same fashion before the top parts of the vocal folds close. But what happens in terms of the air moving through the vocal folds, which you can hopefully see in this representation, is that they're inherently complex. It doesn't pop open in a nice, beautiful sine wave. It is something more jagged and harder to understand than that. I will say, however, that when you do have vocal folds that are thinner and very tense, that glottal cycle will tend to become more sinusoidal. There'll be less difference between the tops and the top and the bottom halves of the vocal folds. They're both going to be basically both going to be doing the same thing at the same time. I think I said bothically there, which is fun. I didn't mean to. Anyways, just want to see if you're paying attention. So, good times. The way we can measure this quantitatively is through this neat little device called an electroglottograph. And we have one of these in the Phonetics lab if we ever get the chance to go back and use it. So this will measure how much vocal fold separation, hold on a sec, how much the vocal folds are separated during voicing. And the way this works is kind of fun. So this is basically a band with like a Velcro connection at the back, and it has two electrodes on either side of it, and they are hooked up through wires to this device, which measures how much how much voltage is going through the electrodes. So you place the electrodes on either side of your larynx, basically on either the side of either vocal fold, and when the vocal folds close, that's basically there's a small electrical current running through the electrodes, and when your vocal folds close, that basically closes the circuit so that electricity can go across your larynx, basically. And the more contact there is between the vocal folds, the greater a connection there is between the two electrodes in the circuit, so you get greater conductivity between the electrodes. This may sound scary. You don't feel the electricity is at such a low voltage that you don't feel it at all, and you get good data out of it, so it's kind of fun. So don't worry about it. If you really are interested in this, if you'd like to, say, even use this device on your language consultant for this semester, if we're allowed to go back into the lab, I'd be happy to show you how to use it. I will give you one caveat. Because of these issues of sort of the angle of the thyroid, this tends to work a little bit better on men than women, just because this juts out a bit more. It's easier to get kind of contact on either side of the vocal folds for guys than for ladies. But either way, that's the basic principle of how it works. You're shooting electricity across your larynx as you speak. So when they're closed, you get more conductivity. When they're open, you get less. Okay, so this is my students laugh at this now. This just looks like a regular computer to me, but nowadays it's old-fashioned. But this is a sort of promotional photo I got from the device itself when it was bought way back when, 1996 or whatever. Yeah, we used to have these things called disk drives. They were fun. Anyways, so the idea is that it pops out this sort of sine wavy looking thing. It's, as we mentioned before, it's a complex wave where you get greater sort of voltage readout for when your vocal folds are closed, and then lower for when they're open, and then the whole pattern just kind of repeats. And this guy is using it in the fashion that turns out to be the most effective way. Like I said, it has this band which you can connect through like a Velcro strip, but usually it's easier to just like hold it there on either side of your larynx. Yeah, so here's an example of the output you get out of this device. It's normally shortened EGG or electroglottograph. So I'm just going to play you basically the complex wave reading we can get out of somebody reading a paragraph while holding one of these devices around his larynx. And you can tell me if you can understand anything that's being said here. So this is basically the source signal of speech. What's happening at your vocal folds without worrying about what's going on in your vocal tract itself. What's this guy saying? Did you get any of that? I think you could tell that was speech somehow because it kind of gave you the sense of those F0 fluctuations we normally get in English prosody, but you probably didn't understand it because you're not getting any of the segments on top of it. So I'll give you the answer. This is a example. It's a part of, actually, it's not a paragraph, it's a sentence, but it's part of a longer reading, which is for some reason typical to read in phonetics experiments about the north wind and the sun. So I'll play it again and maybe you can follow along a little more easily. Yeah, so with that readout, you could maybe even give this thing a Toby transcription or something close to it, right? Yeah, so that's kind of cool. Here's another idealization of what these things are supposed to look like. I think you might notice in this actual readout, these are going to be pointy at the tops and the bottoms. In this idealization, they're flat, so just keep that in mind. It doesn't normally look like this, but this helps you understand it. So greater conductivity is plotted on the higher levels of this graph, and lower conductivity or more openness of the vocal folds is down at the bottom. So at the beginning of this cycle, we have complete closure of the vocal folds. So we get max conductivity because we have max contact. And then the lower half of the folds will begin to open. So we get this down decreasing slope of a line until the upper half of the folds open, and we get this kind of big leap to the very bottom of the cycle where the vocal folds are going to be completely open or as open as they possibly can be. That lasts for a little while, and then the lower half of the folds begin to close, then the upper half of the folds will close until we reach complete closure, and then we're back where we begin again. Yeah, so that's kind of how it works. You're going to get these tops and the bottoms to the cycle, and then you're kind of going to get a bit of an angle, usually of some sort, in the middle because or at least a curve of some sort, because the different parts of the vocal folds are not all doing the same thing at the same time. Okay, so how can we interpret this? This is an example of where I recorded myself using this device in the booth in the lab, trying to produce modal voicing. This is what the whole wave sounds like that I recorded way back in the day. And it kind of cuts out the first part of that, but I'm actually counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you listen to it closely, I think you can even hear the creaky voice at the tail end of my 5. Like that. And it's kind of funny that I'm listening to this now, because now I have a child who's 20 months old, and ever since she was very tiny, one of the few ways I could like hold her attention for a lengthy period of time was just by going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like this. Okay, but this is what one little snippet of this looks like in EGG format. I've got this recording of it here. Yeah, it never wants to play the little bits and pieces. Yeah, it sounds like that. Okay, so like I said, it's not really flat on the tops and the bottoms, but you do see the repetition of the cycle kind of angularly. And you do get kind of these little angles in the opening and the closing phases, right? So it doesn't all happen at once. Yeah, so I will point out that the completely closed and the completely open phases are really both quite short. And I'll also point out that the closure slope, which is this when it's closing, is steeper than the opening slope. So this takes a little bit more time to get from here to here than it takes to get from here to here. Why is that? I'm actually going to let you puzzle over that one for about 5 or 10 seconds. Why would it be closing more quickly than it's opening? Okay. The reason is there's another force at work, or which we can call medial compression, which is a measure of how tightly the folds themselves are compressed against each other. So this is, again, a midline force. It's represented here in terms of MC, but basically how much are you pushing the vocal folds together? That's going to determine to some extent how quickly or slowly the folds will open and close. So going back to this diagram, just if you think about it for a second, what do you do when you voice? The first thing you have to do is bring the vocal folds together. You got to be pushing them towards each other just to get that sort of light contact that can enable the Bernoulli effect to take place. So in general, what's pushing the vocal folds together is the muscular force involved to begin with. So you're trying to get them towards each other. And then when they pop open, what brings them back together is also the Bernoulli effect. So the Bernoulli effect is powerful in its own right. It sucks them back together, but you can kick on top of that a little bit of the push that you're activating by getting the adductive tension involved, or the medial compression, as I call it on the next slide. So there's kind of two forces moving the vocal folds towards themselves. The only thing pushing them apart is the flow of air coming up from your lungs, right? So you're trying to get them close to each other, but your airflow is doing the opposite effect to push them apart a little bit. But that airflow's got to kind of work against your muscular tension, and then it's also got to contend with the Bernoulli effect bringing them back in together. It's going to take, in short, a little bit longer to push them open than it is to bring them back together. You're going to have the tendency to want to push them towards the middle. And we can think about that in terms of this medial compression. So how much are you pushing just the vocal folds themselves towards each other? This is kind of a subtle distinction, because we have measures of both adductive tension and medial compression pushing towards the middle. We'll define adductive tension as sort of everything pushing towards the middle, including the cartilaginous glottis here, or pushing the two cartilages together. But medial compression is just like how tense are the vocal folds themselves, that membranous structure in which the vocal folds are found. How much tension do you get in this part of the larynx? Okay, so medial compression is caused by constriction of the lateral cricoarytenoids, which adduct the vocal folds. We've talked about them already. Also the thyroarytenoids, which pull the arytenoids towards the thyroid. So you can kind of slacken up the tension a bit in the conus elasticus, the membranes around the vocal folds, by shortening up this distance a bit. It won't be quite as tense if you do that. And you don't get the interarytenoids involved in this, or the transverse arytenoid muscles, because those are only squeezing the arytenoid cartilages together. So that's how we're going to draw this distinction, that those transverse arytenoid muscles or interarytenoid muscles will only affect how much tension there is between the cartilaginous part of the cartilaginous glottis. Okay, so it's also possible that the vocalis muscle can have an effect on this sort of thing, and as well as on longitudinal tension. So we have this muscle inside the vocal folds themselves, which we can contract and loosen up a bit. That's obviously going to be hard to get at when you're actually voicing something. You don't really want to stick needles in your vocal folds when you're trying to phonate. So I don't know if anybody's actually tried to do that. For the record, I think it's possible somebody may have. I just, again, don't want to be a part of that experiment. And for now, we don't really know what effect it might actually have on all these various forces. So if you contract the vocalis muscles, they could shorten the vocal folds through that contraction. That would lower longitudinal tension and lower F0. But at the same time, that contraction might increase that medial compression by making the vocal folds themselves a little bit more tensely compressed towards each other. So that could decrease vocal fold thickness and increase F0. And like I said, you need to figure out a way to get at that while the muscle's in action, which is not an easy thing to do. So I'll just mention that as a by the way. And if you really want to try the experiment, may God have mercy on your soul, because I'm not going to advise you on it. At any rate, we have three different forces we can talk about when describing what the vocal folds do in phonation. There's the adductive tension between the arytenoids and the vocal folds themselves. So pushing along this entire glottal length, how much are you pushing together to kind of get the vocal folds to come together? There's also longitudinal tension, which works in this dimension. And then you can sort of factor out medial compression, which is just the tension in this part of the vocal folds themselves, independent of what's going on with the cartilaginous glottis. And I am going to stop there. So that's basically the framework we have in place for how the larynx works. Again, I do want you to know these technical terms, so please try to study them. We're going to talk next time about how these vocal fold forces come into play when we're trying to produce different voice qualities, and what different kinds of voice qualities they enable us to actually produce. And there's a lot of them, and it's kind of fun to talk about them. So I will look forward to seeing you then.